Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud, but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean let us sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling, straw, and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious groundle sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance. They're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside. They fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine. This is luxury." Because in a way it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, windows. If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus, aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants, patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winter's nature, could throw at them one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol. And since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minute snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard. Getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat, or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3:00 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important. After all, you know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul with no doctors in sight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in a long, relentless war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley GRL, or dense chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard. Peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the hay box, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better. Rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags tucked into an old piece of cloth or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail had first dibs on prime real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness. It was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable, but it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project. A messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly who couldn't work the fields but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pulled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning. The roof intact and their toes attached by morning, saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's frontline defense. Same, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments. Not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits or at the very least mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple raw hope whispered into the smoky rafters. tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit. While other young women perfected their embroidery, Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something rare, a woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't a classic beauty. Even her admirers admitted as much, but she was arresting. Dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a quick musical voice, a way of moving that suggested purpose, just barely concealed beneath layers of courtly grace. Anne didn't just enter rooms. She changed their gravity. At a time when a woman's fate was often sealed by birth and marriage, Anne refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman, then, clever, ambitious, untested, but history was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of pale-faced, modest English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, old eyes, and quick, sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. At first, she played the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence few women dared display. Men noticed. Women gossiped. The court buzzed quietly about the striking Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaison. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had. She teased. She challenged. She refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Letters passed between them, filled with declarations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court. Anne astonishingly said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the court. After all, the king was already married. His queen, Catherine, was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candle-lit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice, not to be merely admired, but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely besotted, he was obsessed. And in his obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anne hit a small snag. Namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades. And in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable. But Henry was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, because she had once been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage. She was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favor, seeing the winds of power shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's own advisers shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling beneath their feet. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the Church would not bend easily. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying advice, tradition, and increasingly the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart. She was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering, scandal, and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII, a bold move given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse. Anne entered her queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bold colors, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir. Anne knew this as keenly as anyone. She was not merely Henry's lover anymore. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were elated, certain the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing disappointment with grace, insisting the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights in becoming the first queen in English history. Crowned with the sacred oil usually reserved for kings, her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Couriers reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces. The once obedient Henry began moving England officially away from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head. All so that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even in her triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their hands. Rivals circled, waiting, and Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but keeping it would demand more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time. But the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world began to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry V had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock was ticking. Anne suffered multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed. Miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away, his disappointment carving rifts between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in. Outside the royal chambers, enemies were gathering like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the Great, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed changes that followed. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, everything Anne was not, Jane captured Henry's wandering attention just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it happening. She tried to reclaim her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the groundwork for a campaign of destruction, quietly gathering accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground. Anne had won her crown through cunning and courage. But in the brutal, shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom would soon see how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully sharpened lies. In the back rooms of court, betrayal was brewing. Silent, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance had been built on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, favor with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous. And in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. Anne had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight. The perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who moved first, knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted an exit, but lacked a convenient excuse. Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were wild, monstrous, even adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Anne, the proud, brilliant queen, painted as a bet. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Anne, sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared, but it was no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to meet her eyes. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gates slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate, and now alone in the Tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. The charges against her were shocking. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, high treason, conspiracy against the king. In another world, such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But here, now they were simply theater, a grim performance designed to give Henry VII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall wrapped in a thin veil of legality. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before Anne set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning words. Dates and places contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all. But the truth was irrelevant now. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read and did not break, she stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm Anne had been brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. But even then, they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. Yet even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the Tower, Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private. Anne comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalized, Henry was arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her must have been the deepest cut. On May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark gray gown of damask, trimmed with fur, a crimson kirt beneath, colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her gray gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hystericses, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anne offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once, silence, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history-maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow chest, because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. A queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter Elizabeth, a child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the virgin queen whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on history. But every small victory was followed by new legislation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, ruled like distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge. A final insult would tip them into open defiance, and it came not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies, but in the quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea, they passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the struggling British East India Company and incidentally reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing prices, and offering a luxury product at a bargain, a few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of tea, it was the principle behind it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable. A surrender of the liberties they had fought to protect for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. Already a city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear: we will not be bought. But in Boston, fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Ella Lenina, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbor, and sat there, refusing to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A deadlock grew, taut as a drawn boring. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same again. As the British tea ships sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor, the city itself transformed into a powder keg. Every day that passed without resolution tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting. It was preparing for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved swiftly to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Each gathering added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the resistance. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. British law demanded that imported goods like tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed. Colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp sense before a storm when the world holds its breath. All it would take was one spark to ignite an explosion. And somewhere among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly taking shape. a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773, dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials could seize the cargo and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once their cause, their claim to rights and liberty would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonian, Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebellion, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, to urge immediate action. But even among the defiants, uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom, the signal. Men disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer, not with words, but with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows. Ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone into believing they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbor water churned cold and dark beneath them, thick with the sharp bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were pushed aside, watched in silence as the operation began. Men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, the fragrant smell of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters of the harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and dumped until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent aid. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that even among British loyalists there was an understanding. Something had shifted, and there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen. No one raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities, the men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was over, the harbor resembled a great swirling cauldron filled with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the night air with a strange bittersweet scent. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbor was transformed into a giant swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. The town woke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, broad sheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions split fast. Among patriots there was pride, a fierce, swelling pride, that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious not only at the destruction, but at the message it sent. If the king's authority could be defied so brazenly in Boston, where else might rebellion spark? British officials were stunned. They had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another riot like those that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected organized, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a window. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Ella Lenina, the Beaver, could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waves. In the official ledgers, the night's loss would be tallied at over 10,000 pounds British pounds, a fortune. But the real loss wasn't measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface, a shared, undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending. A reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. When word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. To British officials, it was not simply a protest. It was rebellion, an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment not just for the city of Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws so harsh they were quickly nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came swiftly, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbor, the economic lifeline of the city until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade vanished. Goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once vibrant and noisy, grew quiet, its docks eerily still. But the punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-governing rights, placing it firmly under the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain. A clear message that British authorities were untouchable. And to make sure the colony's new force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the very citizens they were meant to subdue. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed. Liberty was a luxury the Crown would no longer tolerate. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering of its port closed Its people starving under martial law stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger throughout America. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, pledges of unity, and secret meetings began to weave the once fragmented colonies closer together. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was rapidly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example of them. Instead, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. Have you ever heard of a city older than the pyramids of Giza? A sprawling metropolis that flourished in the Americas for 1,000 years and then vanished without a trace. This isn't a myth. This is the story of Kerala, the lost city of pyramids. For centuries, history books told us that civilization in the Americas began much later than in other parts of the world. But hidden in a harsh, windswept desert valley in Peru, a secret lay buried under sand and time. Scattered mounds, mistaken for natural hills, were all that remained of a magnificent city. No one imagined that beneath the dust lay one of the oldest urban centers on Earth, built by a society that rewrote the rules. The people of Kerala accomplished the impossible. They built a planned city covering over 150 acres, complete with towering pyramids, grand plazas, and complex residential areas. And they did it all without the wheel, without metal tools, and without a written language as we know it. It wasn't until the late 1990s that archaeologist Ruth Shady and her team uncovered the truth, revealing a civilization that rose, flourished, and fell in complete anonymity. After 5 millennia of silence, the stones of Kerala are finally speaking. At first glance, the Soup Valley looks like a place where nothing could survive. It's a desert wasteland, scorched by the sun, where water is a precious, fleeting resource. But the people of Kerala saw potential where others saw emptiness. They didn't fear the desert. They saw a canvas. With incredible ingenuity, they built irrigation canals to tame the river, turning barren sand into fertile fields. They grew cotton, beans, squash, and guava. Cotton, especially, became their gold. They spun it into vast fishing nets, creating a powerful trade network with coastal communities. They learned the rhythms of the desert, building homes from earth and stone to withstand the climate, and they studied the stars to plan their harvests with astronomical precision. Kerala was not isolated. It was a bustling hub of trade and culture. They exchanged their cotton and crops for exotic goods like colorful seashells from the Pacific and rare stones from the high Andes. They were connected, innovative, and deeply in tune with their environment. They didn't conquer the desert with force. They partnered with it, building a society that was not just functional, but extraordinary. Rising from the desert floor like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Kerala defy everything we thought we knew about the early Americas. These aren't small, crude mounds. They are massive architectural marvels. The largest, the Pyramid Mayor, is over 450 feet long and stands 60 feet tall, an engineering feat comparable to the early wonders of the ancient world. But unlike the tombs of Egypt, these pyramids were vibrant centers of public life. On their summits, priests conducted ceremonies under the open sky. At their base, huge circular plazas invited thousands to gather for celebrations and civic events. The entire city seems to have been aligned with the sun, the moon, and the stars. For the people of Kerala, architecture was spiritual, a way to connect the earth with the cosmos. And they built these staggering structures with nothing more than stone, earth, and woven reed bags filled with rocks. It was sheer human will and communal effort. These pyramids weren't built for war or vanity. They were built to unite a community, to reach for the heavens, and to endure for eternity. But here's what makes Kerala truly unique. Among all the ruins, archaeologists have found no weapons, no defensive walls, no evidence of armies or warfare. This was a civilization built on peace. While other empires rose and fell on the strength of their armies, Kerala thrived on cooperation, trade, and shared beliefs. They invested their energy in music, astronomy, and community, not conquest. Their society was a testament to the idea that strength can be found in unity, not violence. They chose to gather rather than conquer, to build rather than destroy. For 1,000 years, in a world of constant struggle, the people of Corral created a haven of peace. Thank you for watching. If you were amazed by the story of this lost city, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories from our ancient past. Imagine a city thriving in the Americas, not hundreds, but thousands of years before the Aztecs or the Incas. A civilization so ancient, its pyramids were being built at the same time as those in Egypt. This isn't a fantasy. This is the story of Carol, the oldest city in the Americas, hidden in the arid Soup Valley of Peru for nearly 5,000 years. For decades, we thought the great civilizations of the Americas began much later. But then, in the 1990s, archaeologist Ruth Shady and her team uncovered a breathtaking secret: a massive 150-acre complex of pyramids, plazas, and homes. This discovery completely rewrote the timeline of urban life in the New World. Carol wasn't just a small settlement. It was a bustling metropolis, home to thousands of people around 2600 BC. What's truly amazing is how they built this city. The people of Carol were master engineers. They constructed 6 large pyramids, not with stone blocks, but with woven reed bags called shikros, filled with rocks. These shikros acted like ancient shock absorbers, making their monumental structures resistant to earthquakes, a brilliant innovation in a seismically active region. The largest pyramid, the Pyramid Mayor, stands 60 feet tall and overlooks a grand central plaza, a testament to their incredible organizational skills and architectural vision. So how did a city in such a dry, desolate valley become so powerful? The answer lies in trade and ingenuity. The people of Carral were masters of agriculture, using complex irrigation canals to divert river water and grow cotton, gourds, beans, and sweet potatoes. Their most valuable crop was a unique, high-quality cotton. They didn't just use it for clothes. They used it to make massive fishing nets. This is where their genius for trade comes in. They established a sophisticated trade network, exchanging their cotton nets and agricultural products with coastal communities for fish and shellfish. This created a powerful economic engine that fueled the growth of their city. Evidence of this trade has been found far and wide, from snail shells from Ecuador to hallucinogenic snuff from the Amazon rainforest, showing just how extensive their influence was. Life in Carol wasn't just about work and trade. It was also rich with culture and ceremony. Archaeologists have unearthed fascinating artifacts that give us a glimpse into their spiritual world. They found 32 flutes made from condor and pelican bones, and 37 cornets made from the bones of deer and llamas. Imagine the sounds that once filled these plazas during religious ceremonies, music echoing off the pyramids. They also found small, unfired clay figurines, possibly used in rituals. These discoveries suggest a society deeply connected to music, art, and religion, a society that valued ceremony and communal gathering. One of the most remarkable things about Carol is what we haven't found. No weapons, no defensive walls, no signs of warfare. For over 1,000 years, it seems Carol flourished as a peaceful society. Their power wasn't built on conquest, but on trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They were a civilization dedicated to innovation, commerce, and shared religious practices. This paints a picture of a society that chose cooperation over conflict, a truly inspiring model from the ancient world. But why did this incredible civilization disappear? Around 1800 BC, Carol was abandoned. The leading theory points to climate change. A prolonged drought and a series of powerful earthquakes may have made life in the valley unsustainable. The people of Carol eventually dispersed, carrying their knowledge and culture with them. influencing later Andean civilizations like the Shivan and eventually the Inca. The story of Caral is a powerful reminder that our understanding of the past is always evolving. It shows us that complex societies with advanced engineering, vibrant culture, and peaceful economies existed far earlier than we ever imagined. The silent pyramids of Caral are not just ruins. They are a message from our distant ancestors, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and a timeless desire to build something that lasts. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden histories. Without the river's life-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks dependent on surplus cotton and food would have faltered. The careful balance Caral had maintained with its harsh environment may have finally tipped beyond repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of power emerged along the coast and inland, Caral's influence might have diminished. Perhaps the goods they once supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer enough to sustain their role as a dominant city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious upheaval, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, not sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, new beginnings. Children who once ran across Caral's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them, stories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Caral remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are still fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For millennia, Caral lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Super Valley. Travelers passed the strange rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Caral's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might hold secrets no one had yet uncovered. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Caral was over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Caral, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Caral changed everything. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization independently long before the rise of the Incas or the Maya. Ruth Shady and her team found not just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life, musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, hue, ancient knock records, and even offerings made to the gods. Each artifact told a story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more. Its plazas kissed by the same winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to remember. Corral stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper than we once believed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey. A story not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They created a thriving society rooted in trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence. That greatness is not measured by how many armies march across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, to create, to dream. Corral's legacy reaches far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the old world. Corral proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desires to endure, to celebrate, to reach toward the divine. Today, walking among Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure. Sleeping under sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, Corral shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.